All right, a very good late afternoon also from my end here, and thank you, Florian, for the introduction already. So like he said, my name is Annette, and I will be leading this panel discussion. Before we kick off with the questions and this exciting topic here, I'm actually very, very excited to also introduce our wonderful panelists who are with me here. As you can see, it's a full female power here on the stage, which doesn't happen often. So can we have a round of applause for this? I'm always very, very happy to talk tech with other females as well. So on my right hand here, we have Sille Gram. Sille Gram is the Deputy Secretary General for Innovation and Technology at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communication of Estonia. So welcome. Then after Sille, we have Dania Woods all the way from Canada here. So she works as the Head of Government and Regulatory Affairs at the Guest Trade Financial Group of Canada. Did I pronounce that correctly? Good. Yes. And last but not least, we have Ambassador Anne-Marie Engtolt Meldekart, and she's the DEC Ambassador of Denmark. So when we would discuss this topic that we are going to cover here in the next 30 minutes, our Prime Minister in the morning also mentioned a couple of times already, when we talk about the tech, that tech can be also sometimes very over-regulated. And when it comes to also new emerging technology and new innovation in the market, it can also happen that there are no regulations. If you think about, like in general, like the AI, which is now partly regulated by the EU, but it took around 2+ years. And when it comes to technology, it can happen a lot of times that our regulations come after the technology should be actually implemented, and technology can already be outdated in that sense. So maybe with the first question especially, as we have heard a lot of discussions about different technologies here on the stage, but not so much about the topics like legal system or how the government could support by the legal aspects there. If you could just bring it out, or what could be the key factors that reflect that the government is actually very proactive when it comes to pushing innovation? Do you have any examples? If you would look at the different government policies, what would you bring it out that this government has these factors that they are very proactive in order to push innovation? Maybe to start here from Sille's perspective.
Yes. When we talk about innovation and public sector, it's a question of risk appetite. How much risk are we able to take in? And it's also a question, how do we define innovation in public sector? From my point of view, it's not about technologies, but it's about the process. How do we procure innovation in public sector? And although I think during the last decades, the role of public sector has changed a lot. It's not anymore like fixing market failures, but it's more like act as an enabler of new technologies. It's a totally different change. And I think that if we talk about failures, it's a question, how do we deal with failures? Are we talking about failures, or are you talking about learning? I do believe that we should talk about learning fast, not about failing, because through learning we get more knowledge to perform better next time. And talking about concrete facts or science, I think one important thing that shows that government is open-minded to innovation is the number of investment into R&D to the private sector or to the public sector. Second, I think, is regulation. How clear and transparent regulation do we have that allows our founders to test their crazy ideas in a controlled environment? And on the one hand, we need to really concrete principles or regulation, but the implementation within this regulation should be flexible.
And based on these factors, would you say that Estonia is proactive when it comes to, pushing innovation and making sure that our legal system stays up to date? What would you say?
I do believe, yes. And I think another important thing is what shows that government is open-minded to innovation is having different platforms that facilitates the cooperation between private and public sector, kind of intermediate bodies that help to define the needs of government, how to tackle global challenges, and on the other hand, helps companies to scale up the ideas by moving regulatory barriers.
And moving on to Tanya, what would you say? Do you feel like, also reflecting from Canada, if you could add some of the factors or like recommend them something like what needs to be there that we can call Canadian government as a proactive in order to, just very much push and foster innovation?
Yeah, I would add to the ones that have already been said. But then the big hallmark for me, and I'm not sure any one government has it completely figured out in truth, is how a government can work holistically across departments or ministries. And the reality is, many governments are structured such that you have, transport problems under one roof, and you've got innovation under one roof, and you've got global under one roof. And when you go digital, as we've all been doing for many years now, the issues bleed across. And they're not just in transport, and they're not just in innovation, and they're not just in, scientific research and whatever. When you break them apart artificially like that, in this context, you absolutely miss things. You don't bring all of your best to the table as a government, but you equally don't think through an innovation you might be assessing in a holistic way as an innovator might. So opportunities get lost. So I think it's become critically important. AI is forcing this forward in a very quick way. That their stakeholder groups are far more perhaps than we initially thought or are happy with. And as we heard on an earlier discussion, I think it was from Japan, he mentioned he's grossly understaffed. And certainly for this day and age, the entire reorganization of government, I imagine, will happen. The staffing situation will evolve, and the teams will perhaps become, in my utopic paradigm, more agile in thinking the way they are in technology companies. So we'll see, but that would be what I would share.
Right, and maybe also reflecting from the Danish side as well, Anne-Marie, would you say, or what would you recommend also the Danish government, like the key factors there that you would be the forerunner of like innovation, and then what are maybe just a couple of examples that you would say that this is what we did recently, and that shows that we are very proactive when it comes to making sure that the legal system really supports the innovation?
I think the best factor for determining whether you're successful is results. You can argue that the road to hell is paved with good intentions and digital strategies and new pieces of legislation that are trying to advocate innovation in certain areas. If we don't see more innovation in society, if we don't find our peers in government or businesses to do better, technology companies to have better opportunities, I think that is when we really got to sort of when rubber hits the road. So finding ways of actually speaking to real people out in the real world about, is there an impact? Is legislation actually advancing innovation? Is it advancing the purpose we set it out to? In Denmark, we have what we call the Digitalization Council. And so, sometimes you have these advisory councils, and you just have them on paper, just to look good. And we actually try to invite them in and also tell us stuff when we disagree with them. Give it a little bit of a critical look on what we're doing. And I think what's been working really well with the Digitization Council, it's a true public-private partnership. They tell us, look, we are getting better at innovation because you either hindered, took away red tape, because you are supporting SMEs through our SME digital initiative that is actually trying to help digitization innovation efforts in the companies that we have the most of, which are the small and medium-sized enterprises, and helping us guide on innovation. And then I think a second piece, apart from measuring results, for every piece of new legislation you create, consider taking an old piece away. The thing about legislation is that we tend up ending loving parts of it. So whenever we're trying to propose removing old legislation in favor of new, someone will say, oh, but that was such a good piece of legislation. I was part of negotiating that 10 years ago, or it really did that for me. And so if you don't want to obstruct innovation further, and most policymakers, they don't set out to obstruct innovation. I find most policymakers and bureaucrats, we really want to foster and advance innovation. We want to foster and advance digitization. But sometimes we end up doing the wrong thing in the process. So figuring out ways of evaluating those legislations, be okay about removing them, kill your darlings once in a while, and then measure the results in society is probably the best factors for determining success.
I will actually have a follow-up question or kind of reflection as well here. When we think about like Denmark, it's a very democratic system for a very long time already, where like, again, the public interest when it comes to innovation and changes in a society are also very, very essential. What would you say, how do we strike this kind of balance there, that when we try to, especially change the very traditional markets, this is what we currently do at Accelerate Estonia as well, like we currently have some of the experimental projects, for example, in the medical sector, which is a very traditional, sector itself. And when we think about how many different unions, and I know that in Denmark, this is also a very big thing, that like the public interest has to be also represented there when you introduce something new in a market. And again, it has a lot to do with the legal systems as well, because sometimes, especially these traditional markets are very old-dated from the legal part. So what would you say, like, or your suggestion in a way, what's the best way to strike this kind of balance there, that we still care about what the unions and different people are like saying? Because at the end of the day, we design these services for the people. What's your recommendation there?
In Denmark, we invite the unions in to be part of the process. So unions, employers, civil society organizations, big business interests, small business interests. And then we do that challenging, gnarly, but very necessary dance of trying to find, if not consensus, at least alignment. And I think sometimes it's about not jumping immediately to the end goal, but think about what are the shared interests. For a Danish perspective, it's about remaining competitive in a world that is increasingly global, not least in this. We love the story, and sometimes I think we have a bit of healthy competition with Estonia, who's the most digital country. But rather than resting on the laurels, how do we think about the next frontier of that digitization? And how do we do that in a way so we're not marginalizing existing groups in society, but doing it in a meaningful way? That's why focusing on the SMEs is such a huge priority, because they're really large companies. They got amazing software engineers and digital officers in place, helping the 80% of the Danish market economy, which is small, medium-sized enterprises, helping them digitalize and scale. Thinking about that new legislation on innovation, it's also about reskilling labor. It's about finding meaningful employment opportunity in a world that is more digital, that is with, might seem alien to some individuals. And that goes ultimately, and I think the main reasons for why we do digital legislation in Denmark is to build trust. If we just want to, add more technology for the sake of technology, we're missing the mark. I think from us, digitalization, that's about thinking about how to be digital first from a perspective of creating more trust. Trust in the welfare that we're delivering, in the system that we have, and the democracy that we're very, proud and believe are thriving in a digital era.
Mm-hmm. Maybe also, Sille, from your perspective as well, like, would you bring it out any kind of, either internationally or Estonia, like a very great examples that this has really worked, some kind of effective like collaboration especially, or making it easier for also for the private sector companies, to come with their solutions and get support from the government side, especially when they have something that maybe is not even tested in anywhere else before, and it's something very new in the market. Like, do you have any examples also from, yeah?
Actually, I really love that you brought out this trust. I think it's a main key word, how to build a good collaboration between public and private sector. Annette actually already mentioned, I think, one really good example in Estonia is our Accelerate Estonia program, which is kind of intermediate GovTech Innovation Lab. That goal is to turn our global challenges into economic opportunities and kind of turn illegal ideas coming from founders into disruptive innovation. And this Accelerate Estonia program kind of acts as an intermediate man in public sector. It helps companies to understand what does public sector needs, because founders usually don't understand how government works, and they don't know how to define the need asks from government. And on the other side, government usually goes to an easy way, procure a concrete solution or technology. But it's again about processes. You just define your problem and then procure solution to a problem. So Accelerate Estonia program helps to bring these two words together and remove barriers to scale up founders' idea globally.
And Tanya, also from your perspective, you're currently in a private sector, maybe especially from the perspective of a private sector representative here. What would you say, again, how would you want to engage with the government a little better? Or has there been any examples around the world, because you have a lot of very international also experience, to bring it out like, I don't know, some of the countries or some places that you really have seen that this collaboration really works? And again, that the government is there to, make sure that the legal system also stays up to date when there is some changes, and especially because you're currently in the fintech sector, this is also something that is usually very, very regulated. And we had a great chat about this when we had our pre-call, and you brought it out a couple of things, so maybe you can also reflect to our audience this
Thank you. So the company that I work for is called Questrade Financial Group. And it's Canada's oldest fintech. So it's been around 24 years. So if you count backwards 24 years, fintech wasn't really a term we even used 24 years ago. The founders had a very strong vision. They wanted to leverage technology to create cost efficiency for Canadians. Everything we do, Canadians are our focus. I joke when I meet government that I'm more a public servant than they are some days, but that's beside the point. What we've seen in the fintech space is a vertical integration. So it's no longer just banking the way we know banking maybe 5-10 years ago. It's also not necessarily just insurance products. It's not just investment products. It's not just buying a home. It's not just property listings products. It's in fact all kinds of products coming together that relate to financial transactions. And so it's very complicated. It's highly regulated in some ways. And then in other spaces, it's actually not regulated yet. And there's a lot of questions around how do we regulate it, do we regulate it, and so on. What we've seen is a lot of benchmarking activity happening right now. Canada has been working for a while on open banking and real-time rails. Switzerland, the UK, Brazil already have it in place in many aspects. Canada is still working on a digital assets policy and approach. Switzerland's had it forever. Liechtenstein was one of the first to come out with token legislation, I believe, if memory serves me correctly, and Germany was also very leading in the way. Some of these things tie back to digital identity, and we know, of course, Estonia was a leader there. So we're looking globally everywhere and trying to figure out for the tone and the tenor of our policy making and of our country. We're a huge landmass with all kinds of different people with different needs, but we're not that big of a population just yet. How do we keep pace with the needs of Canadians, assessing ahead the needs of those coming to Canada, because we've got a huge influx of newcomers, and then equally being very aware of what's happening literally next door to us in the US, where innovation scales and happens so fast with such large investments that our small population and our small country doesn't compare. I joke sometimes that Canada could fit in the pocket of California with its population size. So we're looking a lot at this. We're trying to find models all the time that work. Right now, we're paying very close attention to the EU's open finance policy making. It seems to bring together a number of different sets of concerns that we hope we could find some common ground. We don't have to agree on everything, but at least some common ground so we can advance our narrative and our agenda. In Canada, what happens oftentimes is if we can't get to a point of consensus or form a firm national policy, sometimes it comes through international engagement. So we'll see it come as a trade agreement discussion. We'll see it come as we try to expand perhaps our presence in a region. So this is what I look at all day long, trying to figure out, how can we achieve our corporate mission, which is to serve Canadians and make them, far more successful and secure financially. But financially and fintech have expanded tremendously in definition and scope. So we're trying to work really closely with government and chat with them. We work with our regulators very, very closely, and then try and inspire through policymaking as much as we possibly can, showing benchmarks.
Yeah, of course. Before I take a question from the audience, so you can already start thinking about what you want to ask, because there is only time for, I would say, 1 or max 2 questions. I'm going to jump back to Denmark again. And one of the things that and especially what we have been discussing in Accelerate Estonia, especially because what we do is we do experiments so that we try to test a new solution in the market and then see, how the market is going to react to this and just collect a lot of data in terms of this. So it's also easier to change the legislation. What would you say, how can governments also encourage a little bit more of the culture of experimenting something new and especially, collaborating again with the private sector and being more open for the culture of experimentations more openly in the market? Is there any examples from the Danish perspective that you're very open to also test something, because we do have our own platform here, but maybe there is also some reflections here?
Back in 2015, Denmark was, I believe, the first country to set up a lab. It was called Mind Lab, and it was an innovation hub that was basically created to challenge how we did policy and how we did legislation. And the legacy of Mind Lab, it doesn't exist today, so you might have said we got it right, and now it's all very creative, agile legislation. Not entirely, but what we learned, I think, was one, admitting that you don't know everything. It's really uncomfortable as a government, as a state, to go out in the market and say, we're not completely sure this is the exact best way, but we would like to invite you in. And I think some of the ways that we continue to do this is through the sandboxing model. We've had, in the fintech area, we had a number of these. In the health tech area, life science, advanced biotechnology, we're certainly looking at that. We're increasingly also with quantum technologies, very different type of innovation. We're a lot more sort of far-flung from necessarily having mature innovations in that space. But I think opening up, recognizing that there might be others out in the market that are as knowledgeable as you on some aspects of legislation, so it's no longer only the prerogative of government. And then thirdly, thinking about how to scale it up. Horizon Europe is an excellent, an outstanding collaboration on research between public and private sector in Europe. The Digital Europe programs that we've been part of too. They're raising new test facilities, so thinking about sandboxing AI and AI use cases. We're going to have one of those European test facilities in Denmark. I think the challenges to that is thinking about sandboxes across borders. How do you translate? Because sandboxing also testing what works with our culture, what works with our legislatory system, and even though we've been streamlining a lot of things through Brussels, we're still very different as different nations, different governments, different, political interest in that. So figuring out how we scale sandboxes, because if private sector come in and got a sandbox with 193 countries, and then we end up with a little bit of a different and diverging outcomes, it's not going to be easy to foster cross-border innovation. Secondly, I still think there's a big mind shift in this whole thing. I mean, we've been talking about sandboxes and agile governance for more than a decade. And truth be told, I think many of us still have a little bit of a hard time fully embodying it, myself including. But the fact that you have people from the private sector who often will know even better than you on some aspects of legislation, and then vice versa. And so thinking through how we also continue to build that trust element, not least through the different partners, and are ready to really use a full sort of toolbox of agile governance.
Any examples? Yeah, you had a hand up.
Before examples, I want to mention that innovation risks always comes together. You just have to realize this risk and manage these risks. And what are the main ways how to build up this mindset is to start with small scale projects. We have done that during the past decades in our digital solutions, and it works very well. You can see low-hanging fruits. Then the second thing is that was mentioned already is legal sandboxes that helps founders to test, say, crazy ideas in a controlled environment and to see the barriers and possible impacts and gains before it goes to live. And third one, I think, is to involve, that is also mentioned here as well, to involve different stakeholders into discussions about experiments and innovation projects.
So, like I promised you, I'm also ready to take one question from the audience. I hope there are some curious people here in the audience who also wants to ask. Yeah, there is a hand up here, so can we get the microphone there? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alessandro Paceroni from the Lisbon Council, and we actually do work on a lot of these topics. So now I was wondering, talking about the legal system, innovation, Horizon Europe projects, standardization, often the timeline don't match, and it's kind of complicated because the innovation comes from some projects, but it's difficult to translate that to the government. So any ideas on how to do it from your side? I'm looking there because it was coming from there, but
she can tell you. She can tell you. But as a private sector person, what I encourage, even internally, is co-design. So when you put people together to start design thinking around problems and solutions, and taking a design thinking framework, it can help people step uncomfortably but less uncomfortably away from their identity of I work for X, I must therefore take position Y, therefore I can only really prioritize A, B, and C. You need to kind of make a space to get that out of the way so that you can then together start to design something. So you can say, I need to deliver this to stay competitive and make my VCs happy. I need this kind of like, we're either going or no going in the next 9, 10, 12 months. And government's going to say, okay, well, truth be told, my process is 1.5 years. And even just something simple like negotiating timelines to set up regular calls, to have regular engagement, that's like core basic admin function, but even that's a challenge. And it can be the answer and equally the entire problem to whether you even get to do anything with government. So I think co-design, I wanted to share it earlier, so I hopped in now to do it, but I really think co-design puts a shared responsibility on both sides, and then you can work together to collaborate, but I pass it back over to you, because
I very much agree on this question about sort of co-creation. In my remarks, I've been talking about the challenges of government. I think on the other side, often what happens with these public-private innovation projects, we expect government to take the risk, do some funding, and then private sector and civil society, they'll innovate. If we're really going to do this, it does require, I think, also taking risk on the private side and helping, because what happens if the innovation project doesn't live up to all the public expectation, it is the politician or the legislator in the end who's going to be sort of left hanging to dry. So if you want to do this truly, co-creatively, we're also going to give a little bit of slack to the government on this side. Maybe they don't get it right. Maybe it did not live up to all the expectations. Hopefully no one was harmed in the process. But it is also about not just expecting governments to tomorrow become these super agile superhumans, but expect that the risk-taking and that let's try and find each other and help each other in the process is on both sides. So it's not just one of those, government, you take the risk, possibly take the blame, and then we try to innovate, and then afterwards we'll sort of leave the project somewhat, still mad at each other because we did not live up to those expectations. So it's a different mindset from both sides.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm gonna take the very last question because we're slowly running out of time here. So maybe a question that each one of us here on the stage can answer and quite shortly in terms of the time. Do you think we need a special law, like experimental law, for especially doing this kind of pilots? Do we need this internally? There should be experimental law in different countries, because when we talk about different solutions, and especially when we test something in Estonia, Estonian market is so small. So we want these companies to reach also to other countries. Should we think about also something like internationally or testing this with Nordic countries? If I could also consider Canada somewhere up in the north. Do you, Sille, think that we need an experimental law?
Yes, I do believe that we need principle-based regulation. that outlines concrete principles, but implementation will be flexible inside these principles. And I think there is not one model that works for everyone. So I think maybe start with country-specific regulation and then maybe go forward.
All right.
Yeah, I might introduce it a little bit differently. We know and are familiar with the concept of safe harbors or safe harbor provisions. And so if there's, even if it has to go industry by industry, and particularly for heavily regulated industries, innovation happens organically and inorganically. It can happen through acquisition, it can happen through creation, it can happen in all sorts of ways. Safe harbors give companies a bit of comfort, and equally, if produced with principles, then they can give government some level of balance as well.
For a hammer, everything is a nail. And sometimes for a legislator, everything can be solved with a new piece of a legal framework. And maybe this is not one of those. Okay. I do think it's thinking a little bit about more, how do we equip our public servants to be more experimental? How do we give them the right sort of ability to fail and talk about failure without it meaning that you lose your job? How do we think about lawyers, political scientists flexing muscles within agile co-creation and design theory, and not just sort of traditional how to follow by the book? So I don't think it's legislation necessarily as much as it's culture and mindset.
All right, so to wrap it up here, first of all, a massive thank you to our experts here. And I would say that we really learned here today that, again, the culture needs to change, first of all. And then the public sector, again, needs to open up a little bit more, especially for supporting the private sector to open their innovation also in a state and test it here to really get this kind of experiments and everything. So I would be very happy if you would join me and doing an applause for our panelists here.